2-minute rule. We'll kick it off after 2 minutes. I'm sure I see that a couple of people are still floating in, which is totally fine. I think there's a ton of content and conversation that will be had. But what we can do to start is talk about some housekeeping things. Closed captions are enabled. We do have 2 ASL interpreters, Lizzie, who is currently signing, and Whitney, whose camera is off because he's not signing at the moment. Every, I believe, 15 minutes, they will, 15 minutes or so, switch to give each other a break. At that point, we will spotlight someone else. We will spotlight one or the other. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to spotlight Lizzie. And I believe we can spotlight, I don't know if we can, but we will spotlight the other. So anybody who does need to have a clear line of Lizzie or Whitney does. Now, throughout the conversation, we're going to be covering a range of topics. If there's any questions, don't hesitate to put them into the chat or wait until the general panel is done and we'll reserve some time for Q&A. That's fine too, but we'll make sure we get to those questions at least within as much as possible. All right, in which case, I think that's it for housekeeping. If there's any questions or concerns, drop it into the chat. Feel free to private message myself or anyone else that you feel comfy with. And maybe we kick off with bios now, introducing everyone. All right. Any opposition there? Panelists, we good? Thumbs up? Cool. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. We have the best of the best. I personally realized in researching for the panel that I am grossly uneducated when it comes to sound. And I say this as a designer, first and foremost. I'm absolutely baffled at how little I know about sound. So I'm really excited. I learned a lot myself last night. Researching for this. I know I'm going to learn a ton more. And I'm excited for myself, but also all of you. So, all right, let's kick it off. On the panel, we have 2 phenomenal individuals. Matthew Bennett. Matthew Bennett led sound design at Microsoft for 10 years, where he founded and directed the sound and sensory design program. He worked with accessibility experts, which is really cool, to create a tactile sound design language that improves the Windows system navigation for visually impaired people. And worked with Microsoft Research to develop Soundscape, which is an audio augmented reality platform for eyes-free urban wayfinding. He left Microsoft to start his own company, which is called Acoustic Ecology, with a mission to make the soundscape of technology more intuitive, immersive, inclusive, and beautiful for everyone. He's currently developing new sound and sensory design models for cognitive, speech, vision, hearing, mobility, and physical accessibility, which is really awesome. So hi, Matthew. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kat. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Cool. And then Megan. Megan and I have been connected for quite some time now. I nerded out at the fact that she's on the panel. Megan's a Brooklyn-based design leader with also over a decade in tech, launching products and growing teams for the likes of Compass, Nickelodeon, which I personally nerded out on, and iHeartRadio. She grew up in an all STEM family and learned to navigate the world while deaf and chronically ill. And so this enabled her to develop a unique perspective, a strong affinity for community, and an equally strong dislike of math, which we both have in common. So Megan, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be able to share my experiences today.
Yeah, cool. All right. In which case, let's kick it off with the first question that I have, and I kept coming back to when researching, was, Matthew, your job is focused on audio and senses. And Meg, I'm going to assume that you'd argue we're a primarily sound-driven society. So do you think our worlds have become more noisy?
Megan, after you.
I would say yes and no. I would say we have become more noisy in that we have more devices talking to us. We have more devices that we're talking to, and we have more portability in our sound. We can take our music anywhere. We can take our videos anywhere. And that means we're also, if you're in public, sometimes subjected to more noise, more sound. But at the same time, with the rise of accessibility, I also think about how many people I know who are using captions over sound, choosing silence over sound in certain scenarios. So I would say both yes and no on that question.
Yeah, and I totally agree. It's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. You can't really talk about sound design without talking about noise, and I think things are noisier, not just in terms of sound, but if you really think about what noise means in terms of like sensory overload, there's just a lot of sensory noise out there, a lot of visual noise for sure. We're always being bombarded with visual information, but also increasingly sonic and acoustic information. So I think, when we're talking about designing systems at global scale, people think about some of the ethical implications of AI and things like that, but there hasn't really been a lot of attention to ideas about the ethical implications of sound and how to create not just accessible systems, but sound that actually enhances mental health and promote and is supportive and helps people focus and integrates beautifully with their lives, as opposed to noise pollution, which exists in the digital world as much as it exists in the real world. And actually, the WHO has identified noise pollution as one of the top global health problems, and increasingly we're seeing that in the digital world as well as the physical world. And I think a lot of the sounds out there in the digital world right now probably do more harm than good. So as a sound designer, I have this idea that we have sort of a Hippocratic oath, right? First, do no harm. But unfortunately, that's not really, we're not really living that yet as a discipline, as an emerging discipline, which is a couple generations behind visual design and hardware design and motion design. But we're catching up, we're getting better. And getting better at removing the clutter and annoying audio and sounds that create anxiety. And I think that a lot of that comes from realizing how sound impacts the way that we feel and process information and interact. It's not just it's not just sort of icing on the cake or something that can be ignored. It's always texturing our emotional, affecting how we feel, and creating the emotional texture of the experience for better or worse. And we ignore it at our peril.
Now, in that regard, I know that you, Matthew, have started a design sign with silence in mind. How do you deliver the same experience when it's the sound that delivers the message that triggers the feeling? Or is that not the way to look at it?
That's an interesting way to frame it. I think there are lots of interesting ways to frame it. The first thing I usually mean when I say that we design silence is we start by removing sound. And not necessarily every sound, but especially really considering carefully which sounds need to be in the experience. Just as a visual designer would consider, which elements are really important for their design. And some designs end up being kind of cluttered, and they shouldn't be. Some designs are beautiful and elegant and open and communicate to a very wide range of people. So with sound, silence is relative, right? We can use it as an ingredient the same way that visual designers use space to create emphasis and to communicate meaning. So one of the first things we can do is be sure that our sounds are occur in a relatively calm and silent space environment, to the extent that we can control that, so that when the sounds do occur, they have like the maximum value of connecting with people and communicating and conveying their information. So that's one way. Another way is designing sounds that kind of have a certain kind of silence built into them, which sounds kind of metaphysical, but there's actually sort of a technical profile that you can think about for something like that. Sounds that are calm, as opposed to sounds that are harsh and create anxiety. And they're not literally silent, but they're closer to sort of a sensory kind of equilibrium.
If I can add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Meg, do you want to add to that?
I do want to pick up on your point about, first and foremost, saying or deciding what sound should actually be there as sort of the first guiding principle. I think that's incredibly important as someone who doesn't use sound to be notified or to be alerted or to be communicated with, because the other sensory experiences that replace sounds can be just as overwhelming when you have too many of them. Just as many buzzes, just as many blinking things, just as many touch, whatever have you. Those things are equally as anxiety driven. Like think of the little red badge of notification that drives everyone insane. Those things are equally as anxiety driven if you have too many of them, even when you're replacing sound. So it really is so important to start with where can we have silence, where can we not notify, alert, where do we actually need sound for this? Yeah.
And Meg, when you were at Nickelodeon, and I know that you were at iHeartRadio as well, but I want to dive into Nickelodeon in particular because it's for kids at that point. What was that like? Was sound considered? Was sound considered for those who could consume it? And in creating the content, was it considered for those who could not hear or did not want to be overloaded with noise?
Yeah, it was very much for us a way to guide kids into a digital experience, because we were working with, in particular, the Nick Jr. brand, which was for children age 2 to 5, and this was their first app. And if you think about children's toys for that age group, there's a lot of buzzing, there's a lot of clicking, you touch something, it makes a noise, there's a sensory feedback. So when we started making an app for the same age group, we said every piece of UI that we have needs to have a sensory feedback so that these children can translate their real world experience to a digital one. So it really was leading with those that could hear, which is a bit of a tricky area because children 2 to 5 cannot read. So the typical fallbacks don't really work. We gained from that, though, a lot of universal accessibility as well, because since they can't read, that means we natively had to have voiceovers built into the app. So if we had an area that said games at the top of it, like a space for them, we had to have a voiceover either way built into the experience, because there was no way for these kids to know they were in a game space having no language yet that wasn't tactile based.
What was sorry, Matthew, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, just clicking.
I actually just saw that, just so you know, Lizzie and Whitney have switched. So I'm going to now remove Spotlight from Lizzie and switch it over to Whitney. And go back to gallery view. Okay, perfect. Now, what I was going to say was, for those who tuning into the panel now, I feel like all of this is super useful because we learn how to actually build better software, build better experiences. One thing that we've experienced building Stark time and time again is confusion around, or not for us, but for customers, confusion about how to test for all things accessibility. Megan, and for that matter, Megan and Matthew, what does testing and validating sound look like? Meg, if you can kick that off with regard to Nickelodeon, or for that matter, iHeart, but I'm fascinated about the kids aspect to this.
Yeah, for us, we really had to do the human testing due to this kind of restriction with the group that we were with, but also we were designing for the human element. We were designing sound to this experience to be part of the experience, not just to be accessibility support, but to have a universal design. So we needed a person in front of us to give us every kind of impression they were having to verify they were able to complete the task. So for us, we had to have validation with an actual human through user testing to make sure they understood what we were trying to do. It worked for them. It was successful for them. We tried to have a very diverse range of experiences for that reason. And then, of course, on top of that, because it was so built into the experience, we also wanted to make sure it was working for the brand. It was working for the content. There was that element that comes from, this is our app experience. Is that working for you as well on a design human level, if you will?
Yeah, that's great. I'll just add that I think sound is probably the most subjective, emotionally subjective design element. I've had experiences where I create a sound and we ship it out. Someone comes into my office the next morning and says, "I love that sound," and I think, "Yes, we nailed it." And then by lunchtime, there are a couple of people who have come in and gone, "I hate that sound," and it's just visceral, right? And to a certain extent, when you're trying to design something that's beautiful and functional, you're going to take a point of view. You're going to have some emotional texture there, and you're probably going to upset some people. That's okay when you're actually really committed to a certain kind of language or point of view. But I still pay a lot of attention to the people who don't like my sounds, and I learn a lot more from them than the people who do like my sounds. But it's always tricky to test. Of course, we always try to validate and prototype, but because it's so subjective and because people don't have a language to communicate about sound, even professionals have a difficult time with it, right? It's much more important to just watch in context and put the sounds in. Don't even tell people that's what you're testing. Maybe then ask them to complete a task or something like that, and just watch. And then follow up about more general things like, how did you feel? What was this experience like for you? Things that they can probably articulate better than, "Hey, did you like that sound? Why or why not?" Because I've had people say, "Well, no, I didn't really like that sound because it didn't sound like my favorite band. I like the Dave Matthews Band, and this didn't sound anything like Dave Matthews." So that was the beginning of a long journey about learning about how to do research for sound for technology products for me. So it's kind of like this dialectic. We bounce back and forth, right? Like some of the most important feedback I've gotten is just anecdotal and almost like side comments that somebody, maybe another designer, not a sound designer, but a visual designer, or they'll say, "Oh, my kid said this," and it just really makes me think about something or realize an aspect of the experience that I hadn't thought about, or something that the sound was doing or could do that I didn't realize. So I just kind of try to take in information from everywhere, I guess, formal and informal channels. Try to think about what needs their people are articulating and what needs they have that they can't articulate, right? And then it just comes down to design intuition and experience, I think. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. And when we don't, sometimes that's a real important step to getting it right, obviously, right? And I'm not saying I put a lot of bad sounds out there in the world so I can eventually put some good ones out. But we can learn a lot. And then to get to that most beautiful sound that's just iconic, that everybody loves and recognizes, that lasts for years, and that kind of becomes part of people's lives, sometimes it takes a while. And also, I should just say, you can't really set out to do that. I'm going to make an iconic sound that becomes part of culture, part of people's lives. The ones where that really happens organically, it's not necessarily a strategy that you can control. And when you set out to do that, it usually backfires. You have to kind of do it obliquely.
That's super, super interesting. And the one thing that you both have said now is the multi-sensory experience that comes from any type of sound. You mentioned the emotional component, and that's why it's so subjective. And I couldn't help but think of designing really beautiful brands and how much emotion is involved in that. And that's what gives it the soul and enables us to fall in love. And in thinking about this, the one thing I went back to was, if it's so emotional, and we know that changing the music on a movie scene or in an app completely changes the emotion that's invoked, why do you think audio experiences are largely ignored in software design?
Megan, may I start with that? Because it's difficult to talk about, because the way sound orchestrates our senses aren't separate. They converge and they overlap and they kind of mix and mingle. And sound, we react to sound faster than any other element. So it's kind of one of the sensory elements that helps to orchestrate the rest of our sensory experience. So it becomes embedded with the way we feel, what we touch, how we interact, how we process information. And it's really hard to be aware of all that, right? I mean, we can only be aware of so much at a conscious level of anything, not just this aspect of perception that I'm talking about. But especially when it just innervates everything, it's processed by multiple parts of the brain, which is why it can carry information, but it can also carry emotion. But it's just really hard to tease that apart. And in our experience, it happens more holistically, right? It's of a piece. We feel a way, we do a thing, we get some information from our environment, and we're constantly processing information, and even if we're hard of hearing, it might be touch or vibration, or kind of hearing with your body and feeling sound waves that way, because they are like physical energy, right? So we experience it holistically, and it's hard to put a language to that, even for experts. And then I think the other part of why it can be ignored is just because we're such a visually driven culture. Even though there's a lot of sound out there, there's a lot of videos and there's a lot of music, but in terms of sound as an element of product design, it's really in its early stages compared to the other design disciplines. We have a long way to go, and a lot to learn, but there's just huge potential for a more holistic approach to sound and sensory design to contribute, because it's relatively inexpensive. It's very flexible. It has extreme, crucial emotional power that can be deployed well or badly. And when it's bad, you really notice it because it's so emotionally and evocative. So I've kind of talked around it there like a kaleidoscope. I hope that helps. Megan, I'd like to hear what you think.
I wanted to plus one all of that. I think, right to the point, we're a very visually driven society, but also a visually driven discipline. Like, we as product designers come from apps and websites. It starts as a vision or a visual element. And when you start with a visual element, sound can be a distraction as much as it can a helpful thing, a branding moment. It can also be something that takes away from things. Think about MySpace and how people used to be able to put music on the background on their profiles. That was a branding element. That was you showing the world who you are, and everyone hated it. Everyone was driven insane by it. And I think about, with our apps in particular, or products in particular that are complex, there's a lot of people, to your point, that there's a lot of sensory input at the same time. So if you're working through something complex, you don't also want to have to hear something in the background. Like, someone who's driving might turn off the radio in order to find an address, because there's too much going on at the same time. So I think that is part of the reason where you really have to really sit and think if that's the right time to introduce sound as any kind of supportive element or main element. In experiences like on Alexa, games on Alexa have been wonderful for sound design. Nickelodeon did a couple of those where children being able to do word games with their favorite characters. That's really where that stuff shone, because you can bring in the brand there. You brought in voice actors, you brought in, it made an experience all based around not just the words being said, but every kind of sound that was coming out of that.
What about experiences like Alexa, where data is generally, or information is generally visualized through sound? How do you experience that, Meg, in particular, given your lived experience? And what do you think about it being done well or it being done poorly?
Could you say that again?
Sure. So you talked about Alexa.
Yeah.
And on devices like Alexa, data and information is generally visualized through sound.
Yeah.
How do you experience that? Is it done well? Is it not done well? What are the ways that constitute it being done really well?
From my personal experience? Yeah. By and by, I tend to avoid those experiences, to be quite honest, because there's a high rate of failure for me. And it goes back to a lot of times when you're using an app and a website, you are trying to complete something, you have a goal. Short of it being a media experience, you're not just sitting back and intaking things, you're trying to do something. And whenever there's a high rate of failure involved, it's not particularly something I want to put myself through. And I will look for a secondary way to do that with, in my case, I might use Google's Live Transcribe to read what the voice is saying to me. I know that there was a version of Alexa that had a screen attached to it. And at that point, I just kind of questioned, like, well, why don't I just get a tablet and not use VoiceOver? You know what I mean? There's a lot of workarounds that we come up with for addressing sound and helping support it in a secondary way, kind of start to infringe on, again, the fact that we're very visual. So we already have a way to do it. So we don't need this secondary workaround. It gets a very awkward overlap. I do think that there are some good experiences that have both that primary and secondary support at the same time. Like again and again, I'm going to go back to captioning because that is a tale as old as time, way where we have figured out a way to describe sound that honors it, because you can use words to emotionally describe a sound in the written form. So I can still get the essence of the sound while being supported in the way that I need to be supported, which is the written word. So that kind of thing I tend to go back to time and time again. And I find those are the experiences I appreciate more as a person who has such a touchy sense of relationship with sound.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it made me think of something. I want to hear Matthew's thoughts, but then I want to dive, depending on that, I want to dive into a question or thought that I had. My brain just went in a million different places. So Matthew, go for it.
I just wanted to, I'm going to circle back to something Megan said earlier and then maybe bring it back to where we are now, about people needing to turn off sound so that they can focus on the task, so that they can actually have focus and attention on something that's more important. And if it's like environmental sound, like videos or radio or something, we have no control over that as designers usually. But if it's sound coming from a device or in the digital world, we have a lot of control over that. And I just wanted to say that one of my kind of holy grail, one of my ideals, is always to create sounds that people aren't even really aware that they're hearing until they're gone, because they're just seamlessly supporting, you know, the motion, the interaction, the goal of the person using the technology. And like the real world, where you get a lot of information, the physical world, not that the digital world isn't real, you get a lot of information 360 degrees around you if you're hearing sound, and it comes relatively seamlessly, right? I mean, there might be some annoying sounds, but to get back to what Kat said earlier, it's a lot of it's one reason we don't notice it and can't articulate a lot about it is because it's usually below consciousness. It comes in a more holistic sensory web of experience. So trying to create sounds that, thinking about that and kind of trying to reverse engineer it to create sounds that integrate with those experiences and kind of intuitively amplify important parts of them and kind of reach out to the user and pull them into this digital space or this experience that we're trying to create, is a real important challenge for designers. And it's kind of a new way of thinking. Another reason people turn their sounds off on their devices a lot is because the sounds aren't good. They're annoying, right? I mean, not too long ago, there were designers that I know who were saying, I create annoying audio. That's what they did. Annoying with a capital A. That was their brand tag, you know? And I see where that comes from. If you think about the early days of mobile, little devices, they weren't part of our lives and of our bodies the way they are now. I mean, everybody's, well, I don't want to digress too much. But that was actually the aesthetic that some early designers were going for, that kind of alarming, annoying aesthetic that we had to call attention because this was important. Your device might be in your purse or in your backpack in the other room at the other end of the house. So they were just trying to say, look at me, there's a notification here, or your battery's dying, whatever it is. But that aesthetic, unfortunately, has gotten baked into the way a lot of people think about device sounds, and even sound designers. It's kind of baked into a lot of the common sense things, processes that we use to design. And a lot of times we don't even realize how annoying the audio is until it's gone, right? I mean, we spend $1,000 for these beautiful hardware devices and beautiful visual design and motion and perfect fonts and everything. And then the sounds they make are like, you know, farts and dogs. Not always quite that bad, but the sound, the thought that, and then the intention that goes into the sound isn't always as good as the rest of the design process. And I think that's a huge opportunity to think more holistically, not just about sound, but about touch and vibration and sensory elements for the whole process. So to circle back, I think I'm going to just hand it back off to Kat.
This was super, super helpful. Thank you. When the both of you were talking about these things and whether or not they're useful or whether or not they're jarring or what have you, I couldn't help but think of two different scenarios in which there's a multi-sensory, one sense including sound, the other including a visual component, and the other including a component that combines those to where it can be felt. One is in hospitals with machinery there, devices, where you're getting really jarring, loud, annoying, arguably, sound alerts, and the other being visually jarring user interfaces, which only utilize color, which impacts those who are colorblind. So they're using typically red and green to alert something is great or something is bad, and not really symbols to assist that. The other scenario is in auto design in cars, where you're getting, there are some cars, which I'm not going to dive into this here, but there are some cars that have really jarring alerts, almost to the point where they create a really fight or flight reaction because they're so jarring. And all you see is flashing lights and flashing alerts, and you don't know where to look. And at one point you're like, I'm going to die in this device, in this car. Like, this is not, I don't need to be a designer to have judgment about this. So how do you think about those types of experiences? There are some that do it in a beautiful way, but most do it terribly.
Can I say a little bit about healthcare and automotive, and then hand it off to you, Megan? There's a lot of energy right now going into the soundscape of healthcare and how to improve that, because of the realization that those kind of legacy alerts are so alarming and not safe, really. I mean, they create lots of problems. The nurses tune them out. The professionals in the environment tune them out. So eventually, when there's a real alert, a real emergency, they're missed. There have been many studies about this, and some of the research has shown some really bad outcomes, unfortunately, for partly due to a failure of the sound to communicate appropriately at the time. And it also, if you think about the person who's at the center of that sound all the time, it's the patient, right? And the last thing you want when you're trying to heal is all these annoying sounds. And they're also kind of expressing what's going on internally with your body, So there's almost like a privacy aspect of that some people have looked at on medical wards, which is interesting. It kind of takes the internal and makes it external and public. But what I'm trying to say is that can be a very stressful situation for patients and for families. So there's a lot of energy right now going into thinking about how we can create more beautiful and healing and supportive audio sensory environments that also communicate critical information when there needs to be, sort of a theory of critical alarms that are not necessarily alarming. And I think that's valuable for accessibility across the spectrum. And then just one quick word about automotive. And I'll actually take it into aerospace for a second. Some bad outcomes have happened because of poor sound design and just kind of like traditional alarm, fight or flight thinking in the implementation of alarms, acoustic designs. And unfortunately, it was shown that in some recent air tragedies have been partly exacerbated and caused by poor alarm design in the cockpit, because it was designed by engineers trying to meet a legal standard that was very, very old, much like healthcare is right now, afraid of insurance and legal and all kinds of other considerations, instead of like really thinking about what we know about cognition and sensory experience and how people process information in emergencies. And just to take it right back to our devices, a lot of times the sounds we hear from our devices do create these little moments of adrenaline and cortisol bursts, these little fight or flight moments for us. And that's one reason it can be so overwhelming and fatiguing. And that's why I think sound can play a really important role in doing just the opposite, in sort of creating these moments for integration and reflection, and in a way for healing from the visual noise and the acoustic noise of the world.
Yeah, everything you say there, absolutely. I can give you specific examples as well to back up. That's what you were saying about the privacy element and the cortisol burst kind of thing. So as I mentioned in my intro, I also am chronically ill. I have diabetes, so I have 2 devices that beep at me at a constant all the time. One is a continuous glucose monitor, one is a insulin pump, and there's no different beeps in the continuous glucose monitor. If you're going low, if you're dying low, if you're having something go wrong, if they just need to let you know you had a reminder, they're all the same sound. And if I go into a coma and you play that sound next to me, I will wake up immediately because of the amount of trauma this sound has caused me. And the thing about it is, in order for the FDA to pass this app and being on personal phones, the app has to override every single setting you have on your phone for sound. So if you mute your phone, turn it to vibrate, turn it to silent, as soon as you get that alert, it's going to override it. So if you're in a theater watching a movie or a Broadway play and you suddenly go low, that sound will play at ear-piercing levels. If you're listening to music or whatever on your headphones, it will override it, pause your music and play at ear-piercing levels. And it's become such an issue that people are now abandoning this product because they can't customize the sound, and they're scaring people around them. They're scaring themselves because there's no control there, and they didn't think about actually having a system of escalating noises or giving the user control, because they assume the user is not capable of setting their own warning system. Like, I know what number is going to be dangerous for me of my blood sugar, but I'm not allowed to set that. I have to have the app tell me that. And that is why I think it's so important for auto or anything where there's some kind of escalating system of the different sounds. There's some kind of customization of sounds. If we're going to do those alerts, there is consideration of what you're trying to say. Is this actually a serious issue? Can we let the user decide if this is a serious issue that warrants a serious, scary sound? And without that, you just have users running away from your product because they don't agree with what decisions you've made for them.
Meg, you mentioned a lot about it being really jarring sound and it just blaring no matter what. What happens under the pretense that you are completely deaf, not hard of hearing, not like there's zero, and sorry, let me correct myself. When I say completely deaf, and please let me know if that's not the right way to phrase it, when you are unable to hear anything, what happens in using the device? How do you use it? What is the other sensory alerts that come with being a diabetic that uses both of those products?
It's a very embarrassing experience, I will say, because a lot of alerts will go off and I don't know they're happening. And someone else will be like, "Are you beeping?" And I'll be like, "Oh crap, I am beeping." And for somebody with a disability, it can be a little hard to expose your disability. You may not want to let people around you know your disability. And here's a moment where you have revealed to the world by a product that you can control. But by and by, it's not very useful, particularly at night. I do not get any of those alerts when I do not wear my implant and don't have any auditory input at all. So it's completely useless to me. And again, because this is so heavily controlled by the designers, by the creators, by the FDA, there is no way for me to modify this. There is actually to a point where there are jailbroken versions of this app floating around the internet, created by engineers who are diabetics. And they're not federally approved, but they use them because it allows them to have the custom to the sound. It allows them to actually hack what they need to do. For me, I use a smartwatch. So I set my alerts to trigger on my smartwatch through a third-party application, and then my smartwatch vibrates. So that's a lot of work I had to do because the designers didn't consider me as a person who exists.
Wow, that is... thank you for sharing that story. As someone who designs critical audio alarms, I find that fascinating and tragic, and also a lesson for designers, right? I understand that this company might have been constrained by FDA, and a lot of times the international standards for what these alarms have to be are hopelessly outdated. You know, they're literally 50, 60 years old, and unfortunately, we're still kind of stuck with that, and it's a very conservative area, healthcare, and so it changes. The design change is going to be slow, but I know that there's a lot of momentum right now to do that. And you made another kind of small comment that I just want to amplify a little bit and explore, and that is that certain sounds, the sound is traumatic for you. That it's very it creates this fight or flight response, not just in the moment, but kind of with repetition, right? We build up these, and I just want to kind of pull back and spread the lens out to consider everybody's experience with notification and alarm sounds, because I've heard that a lot, especially during COVID, that certain kinds of meeting reminders and things, people were having like PTSD, not formal, small PTSD, I guess. These traumatic responses to that build up over time with the repetition of these sounds over and over again, and you're kind of hearing them even when you're not at work, and even just the thought of the sound kind of makes your heart race. It feels like a fire alarm. People have said to me, and I think it's a huge opportunity to design better, create better sounds that are just as alertful, convey just as much information more efficiently, because you're not first freaking the people out and scaring the hell out of them. But then it's just got this whole other kind of historical layer of memory and experience and anxiety when you think about how often we hear those sounds, right? Just as individuals in our lives, those sounds become part of our domestic environment, part of our work environment, and we have associations with those. So as I'm designing, I'm always thinking about how this is going to feel, the 10,000th time that somebody hears it, because those sounds have to last years in the world, ideally. And when I find some that do feel good, where people actually kind of like to hear them again, the reverse can happen too, right? It can turn into this kind of this little friend that's supporting you or giving you a little kind of emotional pickup or something, or at least even if you don't realize it, it just can kind of be this kind of little tiny moment of delight as opposed to a little tiny moment of dread and anxiety, and those have a cumulative effect on our experience. I think that's important to think about. And I mean, I'm just so fascinated by the story you just shared. That's just amazing.
Yeah, and I also think that I'm going to replace Spotlight. I also think there's two things here. One is that it highlights the fact that regulation is not keeping up with the speed at which innovation happens. We see this firsthand with Stark and working with so many companies, how far it lags behind. And the great thing is it's certainly happening, right? Big change takes time. Systems change takes time, especially when the systems are very archaic. And one should argue that healthcare is up there right alongside government. Now, with that, I can't help but think we as designers, we as product designers and engineers and individuals building the software need to still work to create experiences quicker than regulation can actually keep up. We can't just say, oh, well, sorry. And there are certainly boundaries we have to work within, but still it brings me to a question that two people in the chat brought up. One is our chief design officer and the other is one of our community members, which is what happens when sound or hearing and signing is not possible for an individual. How do we account for the other senses? What does it look like to account for the fact that sound is energy and frequencies and can be felt in the entire body? How do we make use of that? The fact that we're feeling individuals and we're touch plays such a role in our emotions.
May I go first with that? I'm so fascinated by that topic, and I'm really glad you brought it up and framed it in that way. And I actually, when you called this session "Making Waves," I was thrilled because that actually refers to the physical energy of sound, right? It's fundamentally this kind of physical energy that we experience, and it's also psychological and emotional energy, which is why it's so wonderful and also so complicated. But it's definitely true that our sense of sound and touch are deeply connected because of this kind of like physical vibration. And I think in the absence of sound, we can look at designing with touch and tactile elements. I don't think it's really been done very well. There are basic haptic experiences out there, but many mobile devices have great haptic capabilities that really aren't being fully utilized yet. So what this really means is designing with rhythm, essentially. Rhythm is, it should be thought of as one of our senses. It's sort of this meta sense, I think. It's kind of this primal thing. We all experience it through sound and touch and vision and motion and locomotion, physical motion through the world. But I think there's a lot more we can do with touch and rhythm and creating intuitive, rhythmic, and haptic design languages that use this kind of platform and infrastructure that's already out there, but isn't really integrated into experiences in a thoughtful, kind of systematic, consistent way.
Yeah, I have to say I'm so disappointed there isn't more haptic, because of the fact that it can alert you gently, it can alert you strongly. It has the same emotion that sound does. It has the same system that sound does. And I think, I don't know if it's just the cost to develop or what it is that pulls people away from it, but it really has the most potential of any way that we have to communicate sound, short of words. And it's been so disappointing to see that the industry is not embracing it. The other things that really come to mind are, it goes back to things being potentially overwhelming. Like, we have visual systems that we can use to fall back on to communicate sound in the same kind of way, with like visualizers or anything that's not based on words. Again, words will always be a default because we're communicating, we use words. But for, again, the emotion, for alerts, pauses, things like that, it'd be lovely to see more of that. But it, again, goes back to it potentially being sensory overwhelming and just being too much to communicate that sound at all in this scenario when you're also on a visual device.
Do you think the reason why we haven't designed haptic experiences yet, or efficient sound experiences for software yet, is because the tooling is not primed for adoption overall? And I ask this, ignorantly, because we saw this with accessibility software too, where for a very long time, accessibility is not new, right? Digital accessibility is not new. It's been around for decades as a topic. But until recently, the software that enabled these companies to efficiently do their job didn't exist. Is it the same for sound and haptic design?
It's very similar. I wouldn't say it's for sound so much. There are well-known systems and pipelines and kind of relatively easy ways to integrate sound into your design process. I think that's more of a cultural and philosophical orientation that can be grown. I know a lot of visual designers are very interested in sound, and I think I've done some things to sort of help them kind of become sound ninjas and how to think about sound, even if you're not a sound designer. There's some really wonderful basic things that you can do that can help create beautiful experiences. So part of it is just changing the culture. When you're talking about sound all up, when you're talking about haptics, that is a little more specific and technical in terms of the pipeline and the tools and how you actually develop haptics. And there's some, it's getting a lot easier and kind of more intuitive and more standardized. There's some really neat tools out there right now, but I still don't think there's any kind of universal standard. I think there's a huge opportunity for someone to create that. And first of all, to create a killer experience with haptics that's not just a buzz or two. Some of these haptic engines have very nuanced responsiveness that our sense of touch can easily pick up on very intuitively. Basically, you can do some really cool kind of little mini rhythmic things with touch. And if you pair that with the contour of sound, or you think about the contour of speech and how that might be supported with a simultaneous haptic that has not just duration, but it can be soft, or haptic can kind of be soft or loud too, right? It has an amplitude, so you can have a soft touch or a louder touch, a firmer, stronger touch. And once you start to combine those things, you can do some really subtle, beautiful things within a very simple syntax and language. And no one's really done that yet. I think once someone does, everyone's going to follow and copy that, because it's just kind of, it's ripe for innovation in that area right now, because like I said, there's just this huge installed base of beautiful haptic engines that really aren't being used. I mean, the iPhone has great haptics, and in some cases those are being utilized. I don't want to make it sound like no one's ever done haptics. There are some interesting things out there. And the Taptic engine, I don't know if you know about the Taptic engine on the iPhone, which actually lets a user customize a haptic for a specific function in the system by tapping the rhythm that they want, and then the system learns that rhythm and plays it back through the haptic actuator. It's really, really cool. It's been around for a while, but there's so many other cool things in iPhone that it kind of got pushed down the totem pole, I think, in terms of people's general awareness. But as a designer, I find that like super exciting. But that's more of a consumer, individual facing, implementation. In terms of like broader systems, I just think there's a huge opportunity for growth there, and to solve some problems that people don't even realize they're actually having right now.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, also your point about the iPhone having that, and your point about this sometimes being a issue, which is, I forgot what phrasing you use, like socialization or between companies or what have you. The iPhone has this, Android doesn't. So this is not a universal experience that can be optimized between the two. Like I, however, have an Android, because Android relies really heavily on captioning and live transcription, and that's built into the phone, so I can't have an iPhone. And so there's the two companies, it's like almost a cultural thing, because these two companies have decided to culturally prioritize different parts of accessibility and aren't sharing with each other. And as a result, we lose out from that. And I think that's part of the problem with developing hardware, developing anything that has any accessibility that comes with hardware. And then also for those of us to do with software, there's a cultural problem in many of our companies with, I like to call the MVP problem, which is you must strip everything down to the base level and meet 1, not 10, 1. We're going to ship 1. And then that means sound gets cut out 9 out of 10 times. So don't even think about what you're replacing sound with, and that's a cultural issue as well. You need to have your company on board with doing a little bit more, doing it better, and not just shipping the base, meeting the base, So I think it really does come down to shifting some of the culture and tech across the board, whether it's internally in our companies or the big ones as well.
So I think without diving too much into MVP, I think it's become I think it's long been an excuse to ship shit. And that's a topic for another time. We can have a whole webinar on that. I want to go back to something that was discussed before about anxiety spiking, alerts and sound, and using different senses. Matt, when you worked on the, I think it's called the gentle reminder for calendar, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong. One thing that you talked about in there is the anxiety that happens with calendar sounds, and how important it was to really hone in on creating the right tune for that. And in there, you talk about it being this long sound, and it's open and it's not alarming, and there's this bloom that comes with it, and then this tail to close out. And there's this whole process of creating this sound. But in there, I couldn't help but think, well, how the hell do you give me that if I can't hear it? How do you give me that same experience? And so for you, I'd say, well, how are you designing that experience when there is an absence of sound?
That is a wonderful question, and I don't have that solved yet because unfortunately it's not something that I've been asked to do, but I've certainly been thinking about it a lot, and I look forward to the first opportunity I'll have to actually execute on something like that. But first of all, just let me say that's a great explanation of what I said a while ago at some point about the what was then the Windows 10 calendar alert, which is, I'll just kind of paraphrase if I might. It's kind of a long sound. It's about 2.5 seconds, I think, 2 seconds, something like that, which is very long for a UI sound. But the idea is that you don't actually hear the whole thing. You more kind of feel it. Because it's got like a very slow attack and an envelope that kind of comes, we think in envelopes, just like motion designers. It's got sort of a slow onset. The core of the sound is actually about 400 milliseconds, which is right in the norm. And then it's got this really long kind of transparent tail. So if you're hearing, it can create this beautiful experience. Although I have to say, after about 6 years of that, hearing it all over the world, I kind of got sick of it. And it's time to create a shorter one. Anyway, that said, it's all about the envelope, right? How the sound moves through time, and that's the same thing we can think about with rhythmic experiences. Like if I was going to create a haptic to mirror that and to actually support it, maybe be played in real time along with it, I would think about the envelope. I would think about sort of a slow opening, basically a beginning, middle, and an end, right? You've got this introduction that lets people know something is about to happen. The same way when you take an in-breath, you have, someone around you knows that you're about to say something. You don't just like launch in and start talking, at the top of your voice. You kind of ramp into the communication. So it's a way to kind of, from the cognitive landscape, kind of start reaching into somebody's attention, go, okay, something's about to happen here. This is maybe just 200 milliseconds. But it kind of primes them and lets it not be as startling. When the most startling sounds happen with a very quick onset. There's really no bloom. There's just a very quick attack. And there's a reflex. Can't remember exactly what it's called right now, but we are wired to kind of turn our heads toward that sound and to attend to it. It just overrides everything else that's going on. You can't help it. It's a reflex of your cognitive systems. And then also the whole fight or flight thing comes along with that. So basically, I would think about the envelope, about how the touch experience moves through time in the same way that the sound moves through time. And like Megan was saying, the sound and touch are basically the same thing. They're at different ends of the spectrum of vibrational physical energy. And we can learn a lot from that. We can think about sound more as touch, and we can think about touch more as sound. And that has a lot of implications for how we design, and we can use a lot of the same strategies, and they can inform each other.
Yeah, I think I would also add to that. I think the one thing we haven't talked too much about is, visualization, because again, we're already doing a lot with visualization on our phones and these tiny little devices. We don't want to overwhelm. But I always go back to how many of the original solutions for deaf and hard of hearing people were flashing lights. And those are very jarring. But now we have things like hue lights, which are very soft, shifting light colors. Nobody's really done anything with that. We use them in my home for waking us up in the morning. My options are either light for my alarm, vibrations of my watch, or one of those shake awakes, which are some of the most violent shaking devices I've ever experienced in my life, and I don't like to wake up with them. But the hue light bulbs are nice, and they're a very gradual kind of thing. And we don't do that for alerts on phones or computers, like something like a calendar. Like you were describing the sound the calendar makes, and it's like a long tail, and like I forgot what else you said. And I was like, I can see that visually. Like when you were describing it, I see it visually because I think visually. So I was like, what if there was like a small screen in front of me where there was a light changing from one color to another in a long kind of pull that has the same emotion? That hasn't been touched on too much, I think, because the audience is seen as too small for that. It's an external kind of device. It doesn't really make sense. But I do think all we have for push notifications right now on our Windows is that it comes in from the side and comes back. Like we're losing a lot there. We're leaving a lot on the table there, working with light and visuals in the same emotional way we could for sound and touch.
Do you think, especially as someone who has experienced this firsthand, the struggle with using, I guess, products that are predominantly sound focused, do you think that, or alert, I should say, sound alert focused, would you still have as beneficial of an experience if the software utilized things like pulsating color and visualized sound waves in conjunction with haptic feedback to, I guess, to demonstrate anticipation and alert and urgency? Meg?
Yes, I mean, it goes back to hardware and the cost of it, trying to develop it. Most companies will jump straight to a bright strobe flashing light for any kind of alert. And so it goes back to there's no system there. There's no level of different So like my fire alarm and my flashing doorbell are very different levels of alertness for me. My fire alarm, I need to get out of the building. My doorbell, I can maybe take my time getting to my door. You know, it's not necessarily, maybe I can ignore it. Yet the visual that's being given to me is the exact same level of urgency because nobody's put in that additional work to figure out how to add that anticipation through light and color, add levels, have a system of customization and that kind of thing. If they have, it's not well known, probably because it's harder to mass manufacture, that sort of thing. But it really isn't fair. I'll say it really isn't fair for someone like myself to just have to be stressed out and alert all the time to be aware of what's going on around me. I would like to have a gentle experience that everyone else has.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we touched on this before everybody else joined. And so I think I'm kind of obligated to bring it up. What do you think about the use of AI? I feel like I have to bring it up. The use of AI in, you know, with regard to sound and software now.
For me, I am not a fan because AI is so flat. AI is typically used for, you know, voiceover. Like the thing I typically go to is the TikTok, reading the words on the screen. So it becomes, the words on the screen are a workaround for audio, so you can be able to read them, but then we put another workaround on top of it, and you lose so much nuance in there. And the voice is just, in of itself, is so robotic that it's just so off-putting to me. I've lost all nuance at that point. I've lost what the original sound was. I've lost what the words were supposed to be in the description, and now it's just being spit out to me in a robotic manner. I'm not a fan. I feel underserved.
Yeah, when we mentioned that, just as we were kind of meeting up before this started, I was really fascinated to hear Megan say that that because the AI voices are so flat, they're harder to hear and harder to understand. Because I never thought about the contour of language. I thought a lot about the contour of language and how to get that into sounds in different ways for different reasons. But I had never thought about it as an affordance for accessibility. So when there's, you know, sound, language is sort of a form of music. It's got pitch and rhythm, and you can tell a lot about how I'm feeling and how I'm thinking by my cadence and by my up and down inflections. And that can all be studied and notated and documented and analyzed just like music. But when you do that, when you have more variation basically in the information stream, there's more to pick up on. And even if you can't pick up on every little nuanced consonant or fricative or something, you can probably pick up on the emotion for one thing to start, because that's really what's encoded into the contour of the language. And I just think that's a really interesting space to think about for how we design sounds for people who are hard of hearing. And I think there are a lot of strategies that haven't really been explored yet, just because it's an area a lot of sound designers don't think about. You know, they might think about designing sound for visually impaired people or something, but we can actually design sounds for people with hearing impairments. And again, forgive me if I'm not saying that in exactly the right way, and I'm please correct me, but I'm just thinking like the hard of hearing community, and people who are maybe deaf but have a little bit of hearing, if that's okay to say. You know, you can design with different frequency profiles. Most people who are hard of hearing are kind of missing some of the high frequencies, and just everybody as they get old, kind of that's a natural experience as the high frequency hearing deteriorates. So it's one of those accessibility things that really is just helps everybody, right? Because if we design with a wider frequency profile in mind, it can be intelligible. And that contour thing that Megan was talking about, the flatness of the AI voice, is actually something that we could use along with that to make sounds that we're sure are intelligible to more people.
Yeah, I like that we keep going back in this conversation to emotion when it comes to sound, because to your point, when we translate sound into, for example, American Sign Language, the interpreter is going to use her face to emote, to change the meaning of the word. So emotion is still being translated. When we translate it into words, we'll use more descriptive words. When we use adjectives, So emotion is still being translated. Something like AI, like what we just talked about, it's so jarring because emotion isn't being translated. We talked about light and how there's a system of sensitivity there. And again, it's because emotion needs to be translated. So versus when we just have a flashing strobe light, there's no sensitivity, no emotion being translated. So what I really keep coming back to in this conversation is that regardless of what you do for your accessibility choice here, both when you first design sound, you need to design it with emotion, but then when you translate it into a secondary experience, you have to make sure the emotion carries through in order for it to be effective.
That's so cool, Megan. I love that formulation. Like it's the actual absence of emotion that creates the problems sometimes. That's a really interesting way to kind of flip it around and think about it. I'm going to think about that a lot. Thank you.
So I personally have no short of a quadrillion additional questions. However, I want to make sure that we reserve some time to go through the actual chat and answer a ton of the questions that came in from the attendees. So before I actually jump into that chat, I want to ask the both of y'all, what products or software have you used that have phenomenal sensory experiences? And I say sensory because, hey, we all don't rely on sound, and some of us don't rely on visual cues. So what has worked? What is a beautiful experience that you've used that works for you?
Well, I will say I don't have a lot of great multisensory experiences right now with technology, but that might, in the digital world, that might be my own sensory issue. But I do have a really consistently good experience when I am driving my car. And actually, automotive car driving is a really great microcosm to think about sensory experience and sensory design. And a lot of great sensory design goes into a lot of cars. And as you were saying earlier, Kat, with the alarm design and information flow, design of information flow, sometimes there are problems, right? Especially when you start to put these layers of digital technology on top of these physical kind of analog devices. But the sensory experience of driving a car, I think, should be kind of kinetic and tactile. And I love that my car has some technology in it. But I really have this pet peeve about touch screens that take your attention away from driving, because there's so many menus deep that you have to, to change the fan speed or the temperature, you have to like hit 5 different buttons and go through 5 different screens. That's just ridiculous. That should be illegal because it's so unsafe, I think. So my car actually has a combination of old style buttons, kind of tactile analog buttons that I can reach for and touch. They've actually got these textured ridges around them, so I can tell which one is the radio, or it's not a radio anymore. Well, yeah, it's still a radio. Which one is the digital radio? Which one is the heater? Whatever. And I can do some crucial things while I'm driving, while I'm talking, and it just feels really good. You reach out. It's one gesture. It just feels really great. So I have to say that the mixture, and I've seen that coming back in other cars too. My car's not new; it's kind of old, but I really love that about it. One reason I got it is it's got a great sound system, and I love the technology. But I also really love that some of the analog, tactile, physical sensory stuff is preserved from older cars. There's this digital is not necessarily better. There's a lot to be said for tactile and analog sensory interfaces. And I think where it really gets powerful is when we start to bring the two together.
Well,
Yeah.
now I have to, sorry, Mike.
No, you can go for it.
Well, we're generally a room of designers. So Matthew, I have to ask, what kind of car are you driving?
Okay, so it's an old Land Rover. It's if people are into Land Rovers, it's a Discovery LR4. And I will say though, since I've just praised it, that similar to what you said about the alarms that are really jarring, there are some kind of navigational and parking alarms in there that are so harsh that they're kind of counterproductive, right? That everybody in the car just kind of jumps, and maybe that's just my driving triggers these things, but it's a consistent thing that could have been done a little bit better. And kind of like Megan was saying about, does everything that's important have to be like so alarming? And I've just thought a lot about the strategy of critical alarm design. How alarming do they have to be, and can we terrace it and lead people to, everything isn't life or death until it is for somebody who's diabetic or in a hospital, or in a car in some situations. But even then, loudness is not the same thing as audibility. And that's what a lot of sound design misses, I think. And that's what a lot of the standards miss. They don't have any of the kind of newer psychoacoustic, it's actually not even that new, research about how people perceive and how quickly they process sound. If you think about the canopy of bird sounds in a rainforest, okay, this is one of my favorite examples. It's there's a lot of audibility there, and you can hear those sounds for hundreds of yards, and you can disambiguate this rich tapestry of sounds, and they're all very, very audible, but they're not necessarily loud. In fact, a lot of people find those experiences very calming and serene, right? So we can use ideas like that and those kind of spectral profiles and those little kind of music and rhythmic profiles that birds have. I'm not saying a bird sound is the source of the soundscape of the future, but there are characteristics there that we can use when we design that help us disentangle audibility from loudness. One of the biggest problems in sound design is just the default that loudness equals audibility. And that's where we get a lot of the really bad experiences.
Very nice.
All right. Meg, did you want to jump in, or should we jump to Q&A?
I spent this entire time trying to think of an experience I would name, and I can't come up with one. I feel like the most
That's an answer in itself.
It's like the most tactile things we own or have. Like, I just keep going back to like children's toys. Like, I have a nephew who's one, and like these are all designed with all the senses in mind because they're meant to stimulate, the child. But the way they are still designed, like the way the buttons are still designed, that's what we see in the old cars. And it feels like everyone's just running away from that design as design progresses because they're like, it's old, it's been done, you don't want to do it anymore. But truly, that is it. Like, going back to children's toys, going back to car knobs and buttons, like that tactile designs are the goal. And I think that was part of my joy at Nickelodeon, was I was able to actually design to that, knowing that that was our role model. So it felt like I was really hitting the target with my design, because so much has already gone into those experiences. I could reuse them versus being an environment that was forcing me to run away from them in the name of innovation and being modern and current. So I think that's kind of my answer there.
Yeah, I think that's answer in itself. Sorry, I was switching the spotlight. Okay, so now I want to jump into the chat. There's a ton of questions there. When I call it out, I mean, there are some that are only shared with the hosts and panelists. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to read them so that everybody else, and I'll also try to repost them just in case anyone can't hear. But a few of these have been tackled already. Let's see. Is there any guidance we can use, like WCAG, in terms of sound design to enhance the accessibility of it? Ooh, good question.
There should be.
Yeah, also be
if we only knew a company who was interested in things like that. Yeah, I'm not aware of anything right now except designers sharing best practices and maybe a paper here or there, or a panel discussion here or there. But I think there's a huge need for more kind of standardized best practices, and maybe something for experts, and then also a tier to empower other designers who aren't necessarily sound designers first, to get some of the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot that could be done. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. There's my next job right there.
Yeah, I mean, the reality, and maybe it doesn't want to be talked about, but I think it's the elephant in the room. The WCAG standards also need to evolve. And there's a ton in there that don't account for the reality of technology today or technology tomorrow. And that goes right in line with regulation. The speed at which they're evolving is not going to be able to keep up with how quickly technology is evolving. And so I would have been very, very surprised had Meg or Matthew come up with an answer to any type of standard for sound design to enhance accessibility. Because if anybody can find it, please point it to us. Meg, is there anything that you know of? Okay. It's like maybe I'll use someone at Nickelodeon that we don't have. Okay.
No,
So
we had like trial and error. It was trial and error, and does it fit for our audience? And that was it.
yeah.
And like Meg was saying before, a lot of what's out there right now is almost a case study in what not to do for whatever reasons. Not that, you know, regulatory reasons, whatever that we've already talked about. But they don't account for the way that technology and those sounds and sensory experiences are integrated into our lives.
Yeah. So Angel, who posted the question, sorry that there was not a concrete answer to that, but also join the club. So there's another one of the attendees, Philip, didn't necessarily post a question, but wanted to actually touch on the user experience design behind the healthcare field, and said that designing experiences for doctors and nurses, they've found that avoiding using sound in already noisy environments. And so important to understand that the entire healthcare industry is built around stability, and stable systems help save lives, and unstable systems are inherently dangerous. And so keeping systems stable means that it's important to make any introduction to changes slowly. And so physicians and nurses are super, super bonkers right now with workload, to the fact where suicide rates have actually gone up in the healthcare industry. And so what they want is, hey, I need and want everything electronically. I need that to become, you know, easier to change and more efficient overall. But please don't change anything or make me learn anything new. And so there's inherent challenge with the overall experience design, because there's the actual healthcare professionals, and then there's the individuals that are sitting in that room for 16 hours per day, listening to those monitors go off, and, you know, experiencing the different type of cortisol drip that happens and the fight or flight that happens for both parties. It's a really great point. I imagine that's a massive user experience challenge. Let's see what else we have. Sorry, I'm just going through here. Do we need, so this is from Benedict, our Chief Design Officer. Listening to this amazing panel, one thought that's sticking with me: do we need to evolve the product design education to be by default multi-sensory and multimodal? It feels like we're leaving an enormous amount of potential on how to reach and connect with people, aka customers, on the table due to a lack of knowledge. Megan's point on the low benchmark made me think of this.
Absolutely. I absolutely think that we need to, that the solution, one solution to this problem starts at design schools, and actually making sound and sensory design part of the curriculum. And then a whole bunch of other things flow from that. Whether it's in bigger companies, I've worked with creating kind of educational programs for designers to kind of help them, you know, have a little toolkit of strategies and sounds that they can use. Visual designers, I should say, to have a toolkit that they can use. And there are lots and lots of ways to do that, but I think it starts at the earliest levels of design education, and how we think about a more holistic approach to the whole paradigm.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Some of my design education was involved animation, involved making videos, and that meant motion and sound was included, and that was like a 1/4 class at the college I went to at RIT /NTID. But think about those things, and again, it goes back to emotion. You get that education on how to incorporate the emotion of sound, because that's really what they're looking for. It's like, I don't think we made anything significant. I think I had something about like a llama running across the screen, but I had to work with emotion and I had to convey it both visually and auditory. And when I think about that college, you know, so many people came out of it and went into a lot of the product design companies that we have now, like people at Pinterest, people at Lyft. They were from the new media program, and they were the ones that ended up with the most success in product design, are the ones who had to work with multiple forms of media and multiple forms of input, including hardware in some cases. So I think that's really what the true, in my opinion, personal opinion, the true foundation of an all-around successful product designer is someone who literally touches all of those senses, works with hardware, and then that will help you really succeed in the long run.
I love the idea of making that, of approaching it as emotional design with multisensory, with a multisensory framework, maybe that ladders up to that. You know, maybe the curriculum instead of classes should be emotional design 100, 200, 300. And I'll just also say that that's not really usually a heavy lift with visual designers and motion designers. Usually once this discussion starts, they love it. They're hungry for this stuff. It's the kind of thing they think about anyway. And a lot of them are music lovers, but just because of their orientation, it's not a hard sell, really. There's a need for this kind of knowledge, and they eat it up and take it and run with it a lot of times, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. The being cognizant of time, I want to make sure that we get like one final quality topic, you know, in here. And I can't help but go to one thing that attendee Jesse said, which was screen readers in different cultures have a different sound too. That robotic one on iOS is the US compared to Japan's screen reader, which sounds like a human woman. And I didn't even think for a second, oh, how does this change culturally? The words that we use, the way we emote, the language we use to describe things, that all changes. And in turn, any adoption of AI changes, and the things that we can and can't say, or the things that we feel in emotional reaction to certain sounds changes. Have y'all experienced this? Because now I'm so mad I didn't see this earlier. I feel like this is an entire webinar in itself.
Megan? I'm almost intimidated by that question.
I'm a little intimidated too. It's almost above my pay grade in thinking about, like, I'm very familiar with what we lose in sound and what we gain in sound when it gets translated, but I'm a little intimidated by what happens when it changes cultures as well.
I can say that part of my training was as an ethnomusicologist, sort of anthropology of music. So I thought a lot about how the sounds work in a cross-cultural context. But I'm still really intimidated by it. It's very difficult, especially when you're talking about technology sounds versus music cultures. But there are sound cultures around the world, and sometimes they're connected to language differences, and sometimes they're not. But just in terms of thinking about designing sounds based on vocal contour and kind of these deep archetypes of human linguistic experience, you know, those should change. You know, and part of the power of those models is that they can change to address people more intuitively. You know, whether it's Mandarin Chinese or an Indian language. Actually, tonal languages are a little more difficult with contour, so I shouldn't bring those up. But it's a huge topic. Everything from like the pitch sets that we choose when we think about designing the sounds for a global platform. You know, there's certain it's changing a little bit now because media for the past 30 years has saturated pretty much every culture where people are going to have a device, are familiar with Western pop sounds or whatever. But there's still kinds of musical characteristics that are more localized, and we can build on those to create different kinds of experiences. And I guess we should think of it almost as cultural accessibility, you know, not just like localization, but actually making the experiences more accessible through sound for people from, that's like a whole next step. And I think it's a huge opportunity but I think there's a lot that could be done because a lot of the sound is cultural too. And we shouldn't just assume that all the sounds that we make in Seattle, in Redmond, in Palo Alto, are the sounds are experienced the same way by everybody around the world, because they're not.
Thank you. Well, at least I know what our next webinar will be on, is cultural design. Okay, having said that, I think we're gonna wrap it up now. Thank you, thank you, thank you to the both of you. My mind is blown. I have 10,000 additional questions, which I know is always indicative of a great conversation. I will become annoying and message the both of you to continue that. And I think I can speak for everyone, including the entire Stark team, when I say this has been an incredibly educational experience. And I hope that everyone watching or listening or reading along got answers to their questions, whether or not they were shared or not. And yeah, everyone, we'll be sure to, in the follow-up, share the video, the recording, also share where you can find Megan and Matthew and follow the work that they're doing. And thank you. Appreciate everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.